What if the Bible you hold today, any Bible, has been stripped of Shem's legacy? Because in the Septuagint, which is the older Bible, Shem's line includes Canaan, and we read about this in Luke, and I'll go over that in a minute. But nearly 900 years of history has been taken since the flood down to Abraham, and also one of the progenitors, the son of Arphaxad, Cainan, and the father of Shelah, was just removed, gone from our Bibles. So what happened at that time? It's just gone. 900 years. But without those centuries, there's no anchor in the time. There's not enough time for Babel, for one thing, to be brought to fruition, a huge city and all the wall, what we read. But there's no time for Shem to leave Babel and to cross over the Nile and to go into Africa. In the days of Eber and Peleg, as we read in Jubilees, there's no time for the languages to be confounded and the people to flee and go all over the place. There's no time for the Shem's descendants to spread out throughout Africa. There's no time for the Igbo and the Bantu and Yoruba and all the other different groups of people and languages and cultures to form in Africa. We almost get just Abraham appearing in the Bible, speaking to Melchizedek, and that's all there is. So it would appear that the 12 tribes are everything and Shem is almost nothing. Whereas when we replace back these 900 years, we see that Shem is everything and Israel wasn't even thought of. And Moses, add on another 400 years there from the time of Abraham. So we're talking Shem had 12 to 1300 years to grow and form and become peoples and multiply within Africa, to be this huge group of people, to where now there's at least 2,000 or more different languages and cultures within Africa among the people of Shem, and not even talking about the people of Ham in the north. Shem was robbed. He was robbed of ancestors, he was robbed of time, he was robbed of land, and he was robbed of heritage, and became basically a forgotten people. And I see that in the comments on my videos, where people from all these different groups are trying to figure out who they are. They know that they have Eber or Hebrew in their languages and in their customs, but they can't figure out how did they come from the 12 tribes, or is all of Israel, the whole Africa, all Israel? And yet we know that Israel was taken away out of Africa by ships and by losing their language and their heritage and everything, as we see in Deuteronomy 28. So who are these people of Shem that have been lost in plain sight in Africa? So what happens when we restore these 900 years, and even if you want to include the 400 years from Abraham to Moses, 12 or 1300 years, what happens to the people of Shem? We see this hidden, gigantic, beautiful people that follow the ways of Melchizedek and the ways of righteousness. And we can learn and start to appreciate the story of Africa, not just of the 12 tribes, but of all of Africa. And the rise of civilizations looks very different among the Shemmites, but also among Egypt and the Hamites in that area and Cushites, and also up into Mesopotamia and into the north among Japheth. We can allow for time. 900 years is a long time. The U.S. is just going to be celebrating 250 years of existence. They went from just under 3 million people to 360 million people in 250 years. Yes, there's some immigration, but they grew as a people from 3 to 360 million in 250 years. Well, we're talking 800 to 900 years plus another 300 or 400 years while Israelites were in Egypt. That's a long time for nations to grow and flourish and change and languages to grow, so that we get the Yoruba and the Igbo and the Bantu and multiple languages within each, and multiple cultures in multiple places all throughout the continent. As we go through this and try to discover Shem, we've talked about Ham, most of Ham and Hamites in a couple other videos, like one I just did on Babel and some others. But in this one, I want to talk about the hidden or lost or stolen Shem and what happened so we can replace Shem and give the glory of Shem back to the people of Africa, to their fathers, so that they can know who they are. And for those that are in Africa, I have lots of wonderful friends that comment on my channel, and I appreciate that. I would love to hear your different stories and about your fathers and where you may have come from and all that type of thing. So let's get into it. We can tell that they stole these years. The fingerprints are all over it. If you look in Luke, I'm going to give you this verse right now, and you can see in Luke that if you look in your Bibles in Genesis, you will be missing one of these people by the name of Cainan. This is the Cainan, the son of Arphaxad. He's just deleted, gone, right? 400 years that he lived, gone. He's just taken away, and Arphaxad is made the father of Shelah. The Bible from Ethiopia has the same text and timeline as the Bible that the 12 apostles were using, that Luke used, and that we don't have anymore. So sometime after Jesus, somebody changed the code, somebody rewrote things, and we can call that the Babylon, if you'd like, or the Pharisees. But they made a huge change to the timeline before Abraham. They did this in two ways. They didn't just steal Canaan, which they did, away, but they took 100 years from every patriarch, from Shem all the way down to the father of Abraham. They just took away 100 years from each of these men, not from their lives, but from the time when they had their first child. But by doing so, they shaved off 800 to 900 years of Bible history, gone, disappeared in a stroke of a pen of the Pharisees. I just did a video on this. I'll link it. But needless to say, if you're unfamiliar with the difference between the Septuagint and the Masoretic text, the Masoretic text is what makes all the Bibles we use come from the Pharisees. Although we didn't know that, I didn't know that, but that's where it comes from. The original Greek text, which is 1,200 years older than the Hebrew text that we say we use, or the Bibles are based on, that goes back before the time of Christ, which is why this scripture in Luke and the Ethiopian Bible, while they follow the Septuagint timeline, which puts the flood back by 800 to 900 years from the time that we consider it. And I know I go, yeah, whatever, 800 years, big deal. But think about it, 250 years they're going to be celebrating in America. For what? From going from 2 million people to 340 million people, not counting illegal immigrants. But that's a lot of growth in 250 years. They took away 800 years. So you can get an idea, I'm going to show you that in a minute, how to arrive at least an approximate figure of how many people they took away. But the math doesn't lie. When you restore those almost 1,000 years before Abraham, you can see how great civilizations came and went long before Abraham, how the pyramids were built in Egypt long before the flood date that we have in the Bible. But by cutting out these 1,000 years, they hid, I'm going to say, at least 20 million, probably almost up to 80 million Shemmites over 1,000 years were just disappeared, wiped off the books. Now, they couldn't wipe off the Egyptian issues because we know the different pharaohs, and we know that they lived right through the flood period and continued on out the other side. So we know there's an issue between the Egyptian mummies and the Egyptian ruins and the Bible narrative. But the Shemmites, who were not building these great monuments to man, they just disappeared. They're wiped off. They're vanished as if they never existed. In this video, I want to prove, or at least attempt to prove, that what we consider the 12 tribes, I do believe, of course, in the 12 tribes and all that, but by placing them 1,000 years later, we can see that Africa was already full of Shemmites, already full of people of different groups, like 2,000 different languages and different nations. It was already a full, not just with Canaan, but with all of Shem. For 1,000 years, it was already full by the time Abraham came along and then Jacob went into Egypt. So when the 12 tribes came out, I want to show how they were just a blip on the map. They were not all of Africa, nor all of Shem. They were a tiny branch, one branch of many, many branches of Shem. And that the 12 tribes were not the greatest of Shem. They were of Shem, just like Melchizedek was of Shem, but Melchizedek was not of the 12 tribes. we have to go back and reclaim and understand Shem in order to truly understand the 12 tribes. It's important, at least it is to me, which is why I enjoy doing this. The Masoretic timeline, which is about 290 years from the flood to Abraham, so it's super short. But if we look at Peleg, right, he's about the fourth or fifth down, I think, from Noah. He's the son of Eber, where we get Hebrews. Peleg, on the timeline of the Masoretes in our Bible, he's only 101 years from the flood. And yet we're to believe that there were enough people living there to build this city of Babel. And 100 years, yeah, you might get a small village, even a town, maybe even a teeny little city. 101 years is not very long for 8 souls that came off the ark to bring about cities large enough for Babel to be this huge tower and all the manpower and the work that had to go into it. But if we look at the Septuagint timeline, then there's hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years for Babel to be built. So the math in our Bibles is impossible. It doesn't work. It doesn't work with Egypt, but it doesn't work with Babel. It doesn't work with the patriarchs. It doesn't work with a lot of things. But it does work for what the Pharisees wanted, which was to hide Jesus and the prophecies about when he would be born. But by doing so, maybe intended or not, but they completely hid Shem from existence. They just blew him out of the water to where Shem doesn't exist. And we basically have Abraham and then the 12 tribes, and that's all we know of Shem. The rest of it is disappeared. One of the greatest deceptions that really hurts us in our understanding is because these patriarchs lived, 600, 400, 300 years. They lived a long time. A lot of these men were alive through the lives of others. There was a lot of family alive. So Shem was alive at the same time. No. He wasn't alive at the same time as Abraham. That's the Masoretic text version. But he was alive at the same time as Arphaxad and the fellow that got replaced, the Cainan, and Shelah and Eber and Peleg. He was alive for them and during their lives. So when we allow these hundreds and hundreds of years for these families to grow, we then have Shem living alongside of these other patriarchs. And they were like the leading council of the Shemmites. They were the fathers. They were the village elders, if you want to call it that. And so for this 500 years, and for this long time, there were true witnesses of the flood that were still living. People that had been on the ark, Shem, for instance, was still alive, while Eber was alive. So they had first-hand account of what God had done over centuries, not just 50 years, 30 years, but over centuries, which means that the laws of righteousness that came down from Noah to Shem, especially, that these things were kept alive by these elders, and they were kept alive in the families, and the first languages and the customs, they went through the lineage of Shem. Where we get the name Hebrew for the people of Shem is because of Eber. And Eber is fascinating. His name means crossing over. So, my last video I did on Babel had Babel being somewhere between the White and the Blue Niles. Okay, somewhere in that area. And so what might he have been crossing over to be called the crossing over? Well, maybe the people of Shem were already uncomfortable with Babel and were moving away and had crossed over the Nile River. Yes, they hadn't gone to West Africa or anywhere like that, but they had crossed over. So Eber was called, the name meant crossing over. And we know that Peleg, his son, the son of Eber, was alive or born at the time when the languages were confounded and the people were scattered all over. So even in today, in many African societies, there's still this mentorship of the village elders and the wisdom. And that came from these first 4, 5, 6 of these patriarchs that lived and brought up their people and taught them. So by the time we get to Melchizedek, we don't know where his father was. At least I don't know who his father was. But when we get to Melchizedek, we see that he was drawing on the way of the fathers. Abraham came to him to learn the way of righteousness of the fathers. He didn't come to Shem. Shem was already dead 500 years by the time Melchizedek and Abraham meet. But yet Melchizedek was following the way of Shem, the way of the elders, the way of mentorship that was key to Shemite existence. So when Eber and the patriarchs crossed the river, or crossed that area, and started to go further out into Africa to their inheritance, because we read that they received the center of the earth, or the equator area of Africa, I believe. And because they were going out, they could not go south. They could not go towards the equator right off the bat, because our friend Cainan, the son of Ham, had stolen the land of Shem, which I covered in another video. But he stole part of their land. Some people think he stole all of Shem's land, and I can't believe that. It doesn't make sense to me. Even when he stole the land, he stole a part, I believe. He wasn't a big enough people to steal all of Africa, but to steal maybe part of Kenya or southern Ethiopia, that area, and the part of Kenya, of course. But because they were a warlike people, and the Shemmites weren't so much so, I believe they went beside them. They went around them. They didn't go into the land that was theirs because they couldn't. So they had to go into other parts of the Shemite land further to the west. But when they left, it's hard for us to understand. It wasn't just Eber and Peleg who were leading them. No, Arphaxad was still there. Shelah, okay? Shem, maybe not so. Could be, maybe so. But the greats, they were already still alive when they were making this journey out. So they had this great leadership as they left the land and fled what was going on in the city of Babel. Even before, in my opinion, they started the movement, even before the tower fiasco and the languages being confused. I believe they were already moving and inching their way out towards their own land inheritance. And when we look at the diversity of languages, I don't mean just we see Igbo and Yoruba and Bantu, and there's other groups as well in Africa, of course, but even among the Bantu and all these other groups, there's hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of different dialects and different languages among that group. But linguists have been able to trace those languages all back to an origin. And I believe that origin was Eber, or Hebrew. Because we give back this 1,000 years that was stolen, it allows for all the development of all these different nations and peoples. We have a hard time seeing, because we only look through the Bible window, if I can say that. We look at, yes, Abraham and Terah and Nahor, back through all the way up to Shem. But we don't look the other way from Shem down, who had 5 sons. And then they had sons, and then they had sons and daughters and sons and all that. But by the time I did a little mathematical calculation, of course it's not accurate, but it's just an estimate. But when you look at 11 generations, and if you give each one of the patriarchs 5 sons and 5 daughters, we'll say, but let's just say 5 sons. And those 5 sons have 5 sons, and of course they have daughters as well. But those 5 make 5 more families, make 5 more families, as you go by 11 generations, even by the time we get to Peleg, we can see that there's already 40 to 60 to 70,000 people that are Shemmites just by the time we get to Eber and Peleg. By the time we get to Abraham, it's exponential. Of course, there could have been deaths from disease and deaths from other things, but reality shows by the time you get to Abraham, it's somewhere between 20 and 100 million people of Shemmites living in Africa over that 1,000 years. That's a long time, and that's a lot of people, and they became a lot of nations. And then we see that Moses is 400 years after Abraham. So for 400 years, these people are in Egypt. Add that to the 800 years, we're up to 1,200 years before Moses even steps foot out into the land of Shem as he goes down with the people to take the land of Canaan. But it's interesting, when we put back those years that were lost, we can truly find the fathers of the Shemmites. And those that are listening from all over Africa, they can have great pride in their fathers. Melchizedek, just remember, he was not of the 12 tribes. Yet Abraham saw him as greater than Abraham. He went to learn from Melchizedek because Melchizedek had the way of Shem, and Abraham wanted the way of Shem and the way of Arphaxad and the way of Noah and the way of Adam. He was after the righteousness of the fathers instead of his own wicked father who went after the things of like the Canaanites. And so we see that there's these two religious groups, if you want to call it, or these two ways. Even way back then, there was the two ways, just as there are the two ways today. And Abraham chose the way of Melchizedek and the way of Noah, and his father chose the way of Cainan and the way of maybe Nimrod, and that different way. And so we see this split in the families, and it's about righteousness. It's not about skin color, right? Of course, the Africans were African, right? And as I did a video on the three brothers, when Japheth, Ham, and, if they came from one set of parents, which they did, then they were probably all of them more or less the same family, How we got to be where we are and how I got to be a different color, I know some people that are a little upset about things, say Neanderthals and all this kind of stuff, and I don't believe that kind of stuff. But I do believe that things have changed over time. But I do believe that Africa was the center of Babel, and that's where Noah and his people ended up starting off from, with Japheth going north, Ham taking the center part, and Shem taking the center of the earth and the upper areas, the mountains of the moon. And again, I want to reiterate this point for those that are from different parts of Africa, and Bantu or Yoruba, all these different groups, Igbo, doesn't matter. The heritage, yes, I do believe the heritage is Hebrew or from Eber, but I also don't believe that every single African is of the 12 tribes. It's not even logical, but it doesn't make sense. Once you put back the 1,000 years, and you can see that there were 20 to 100 million people living in Africa all over the place, and probably mostly towards West Africa in that area, and then down into South Africa over time. But the issue is, who was your fathers? Your fathers were the righteous ones. And remember that the 12 tribes, they weren't the righteous ones. We think about them as because that's where we have the Bible, but they were hardly the righteous ones, right? Yes, Abraham was righteous. Yes, his sons to some degree, but the 12 tribes there, Judah and Reuben and those guys, you read about their stories, they weren't particularly righteous. Joseph was righteous, more so than the rest, maybe Benjamin. But yes, over time, they fulfilled what they were called to do, and they went through terrible times. But the family of Shem came from righteous seed, the seed of Melchizedek, the seed of Eber, the seed of Shem, the seed of Noah. They came from that, and they kept those traditions. Whereas the 12 tribes were in Egypt and lost everything, and they tried to get it restored. But the people of Shem, in my opinion, and throughout Africa, they didn't have to have it restored like the 12 did with Moses. They already had it. Maybe some lost it over time, but I don't think they all did, which is why there's so many people in the comment sections from all over Africa that are talking about their languages being related somehow to Paleo-Hebrew and Hebrew words, and where they think their fathers came from the Egypt area, which would make sense, right? And for the Bantu thinking they're coming from Nigeria and all that area. But if we extend that 1,000 years out, then the Bantu, yes, I do believe they came out of, and Igbo and Yoruba came out of that Nigeria, the West Africa area. But what about before that? Once we put that 1,200 years back in there, before the Bantu, they say started about 2000 BC. But if we're going back to 3300 BC, that's a long time. So maybe the Bantu actually didn't start there in West Africa. Maybe they came from the Tower, like all the families of the earth came from there, but they ended over in West Africa. Just something to think about. But to be grateful for your fathers. The wisdom of the village elders is still there. They haven't lost it all. It's the 12 tribes that struggled with righteousness, much more so, in my opinion, than the Shemmites in Africa did. Does it mean they're all perfect? No, it doesn't mean that. But their fathers were righteous. And Moses tried to bring his people back to righteousness because they had lost it, living in the flesh pots of Egypt, as they say. But the wanderers and the villagers and out through all the area of Africa, they, for thousands of years, kept alive the traditions of the fathers. And yes, things have changed and things have moved on, but be grateful to your own fathers. Not all the people have to come from the 12 tribes to be blessed of the Father. To understand the nations of Shem, especially. We're not going to deal with Ham and Japheth right now, but the nations of Shem throughout Africa, let's say 2,000, 3,000, the different nations that were there. And what was the start? Babel, which I did in my video showing it was from the area more or less where Sennaar is today on your map, below Meroe in Ethiopia, more or less, somewhere in that area where Babel was. And that the people came out slowly over time, over hundreds of years. They grew into bigger people, and they built the city of Babylon, and they didn't really want to flee at first. They were nervous after the flood, of course. But they were starting to move as they grew in numbers. They started to build the city, but they also started to migrate to different areas, because we start to see by about 3,000, 3,100 BC, we see Egypt starting. We see Sumer starting in Japheth's area up in Sumer, Mesopotamia. And we see the Cushite lands being developed a bit. And we see movement, slow movement. But then we see with Peleg and Eber's time, the confounding of the languages, and then the people flee, right? They really split then. And that's when it says in the book of Jubilees that that's when the people divided all over the earth. And my feeling, my gut feeling on that is they fled because they didn't, when the languages are confounded, they already didn't trust Nimrod and his people, the city-states, and the ones and the warrior types of Japheth up north, and they started to not trust one another, and now they couldn't speak to one another. And so Shem fled towards West Africa to get away from Canaan and to get away from Nimrod and all that stuff, and to move away and be hidden, which they did. They went and they were pretty much unheard of until they were just forgotten. So over this 1,000 years that we lose by using our Bibles today, we lose Shem too. So when anyone says, well, who's Shem? Most people go, well, the 12 tribes. And even in the comment section, and thanks for leaving your comments. I love all the comments, and I'd love to hear your opinion about this issue if you are from Africa or have interest in that, because it's fascinating. To me, it's fascinating. But to see that the people fled to safety, and safety was getting away from the other languages and the other peoples and going off completely on your own so you wouldn't be touched. And by going to West Africa area towards there and populating as you go, then they were able to be away from all of the conflict and just raise their cattle and do what they did, which is interesting because all the way to Adam, the righteous always were shepherds. They were always taking care of cattle. Doesn't matter if it's Enoch, all the righteous lived in rural areas, and it turned out that Canaan, the city dwellers, is where all the problems came, and it would be the same going all the way through our day today, I think, my opinion anyway. And I want to mention that we don't really look at the archaeology and think about it logically. But if the pyramids in Egypt, the big ones, were in that we look at all the time, if they were being built about 2600 BC, and the flood date from our Bible by the Masoretic or Pharisee text places it at 2300, 2400 BC, there's a problem. Because we see the pharaohs all the way from almost 3000 BC all the way down through almost to Greece, the time of Greece, the Greek conquest. And you go, there's no flood during that time mentioned in Egypt, and they continue on with their pharaoh one to the next to the next. So the flood doesn't fit. So for most people, most Christians, they just ignore that issue. But it does scream, at least it does for me, it screams, that's not logical, it does not make sense. But once you put the Septuagint version or the Ethiopian Bible version back in place, the real version, the one that Luke talked about, the one that Jesus and the apostles used, when you put that back and the dating back the way it should be, then we're back to 3300, 3400 for the flood. It fixes the issue. Doesn't mean it's true or not, I'm not saying that, but at least it fits the archaeology. And the archaeology is not screaming at us that the Bible is false because the Bible flood date is wrong. It's only wrong because some scribes working for the Pharisees about 150 AD, way after Jesus' time, didn't like Jesus at all and wanted him written out of anything they could, and they changed the timeline. That's my opinion on why they did it. But like I said, in doing so, they destroyed our knowledge of Shem. and made, in my opinion, all the people of Shem in Africa that are millions, half a billion, I should say, and they all want to be part of the 12 tribes because it makes it look, they've made it look, the Pharisees made it look like the 12 tribes are all of Shem. So everybody must have come from the Pharisees. It's quite the opposite. The Pharisees were the wicked ones who destroyed the Savior and destroyed his work and wanted his name gone. And the righteous of Shem, they still love the Messiah and they love those things. Whether they're of the 12 tribes or not is immaterial. It is immaterial because they go back to their fathers. If it was that important, then we'd have to cast out all Shem, Noah, Adam. They weren't part of the 12 tribes. Melchizedek wasn't. All the right, Jethro, who helped Moses, he wasn't. So we'd have to say, oh, they're all gone. They have no use. They're not important to the Father, which is just, I'm sorry, that's just silliness. That's like Pharisaical type of way, and to me that's just crazy. It's the same attitude that John and Jesus ran into among the Jews at the time they were here, when the Jews thought that they were everything and everybody else were just, cattle of no worth to the Father. And Jesus showed with the woman at the well and with the centurion and others that all are important to the Father if they will follow the ways of the Father. I want to reiterate that Cainan is the smoking gun. He shows the fingerprints of the Pharisees on the text after Jesus' day. Because in Luke, he records Cainan as being the son of Arphaxad. And in our Bibles, it's gone. So somewhere after Jesus, until maybe a thousand years ago when the Masoretic text came out, which our Bible's based on, somewhere in that time, and most people think it's about 150 AD. So the Pharisees was part of this system, the Babylonian system. They wanted Jesus not just dead, but they wanted him written out of the timeline. He had to be gone. So they went and changed the Bible. If you can imagine, when it says, and Jesus said, not one jot or tittle is to be changed. Well, they didn't just change a jot or tittle. They took out Canaan, then they shaved 100 years off the age at birth of all the sons, right, starting all the way back to Adam, pretty much, down through. But where it really affects for us is from the flood on down, because that's about 800 years there. 600 years were taken off before the flood, but they wanted a lot of years taken off so they could show that Jesus wasn't the Messiah. But they also, these same Pharisees that we were warned about, and Jesus said their father was the devil, or they served the devil, they changed these things to hide him. But in doing so, as I said, they hid Shem. That's why this video is about hiding or hidden Shem, the lost Shem, the lost millions of people, and all the ancestors of Africa just disappeared. And so they also wanted, in my opinion, the Pharisees, they wanted to get rid of the Christianity, get rid of the way of the Ebionites, get rid of all that, and also establish themselves as the top of the movement of the Jews at the time. This is a bit just before Constantine, of course, but they wanted to be the center. But by shaving off all these years, they made the 12 tribes the center. And then when the tribes were lost, it was just pretty much Judah all the time. So then the Pharisees became the center of attention. And of course, they didn't like when Jesus was the center of attention. So, as most narcissists wouldn't. But they didn't like that, so they got rid of the whole timeline. So it would hide Shem and make the Shemitic people look like teeny group that we don't even talk about or think about. Africa itself was full of millions and millions and millions of people at the time already. By the time that Abraham went to Egypt, and then later Jacob returned to Egypt, yes, was great, of course. But the hidden people were the Shemmites all through the great expanse of Africa. And you can see by this map, I'll put it up, and it shows America and China and Europe and all the countries overlaid on Africa. So we can get an idea just how huge we're talking the landmass of Africa truly is. So I'll show this chart that shows that by the time of Peleg, there were about 50,000, at least 50,000 Shemmites already living in the land close to Babel, close to the Nile River, somewhere in that area. And maybe they were starting to move a little bit, like I said. But by the time we get to Abraham, 90 million, 50 million, who knows, but millions and millions and millions, huge groups that had already started to separate in over 1,000 years, were already developing the Igbo and the Yoruba and the different groups of people. There, by the time we see the Bantu starting to move towards the south and all those migrations, they'd already had, in my opinion, by looking at this way, over 1,000 years before they even did the migration of the Bantu from the Nigeria area from West Africa. So these peoples have been around a long time, and we can track all the languages back to one group, as I said. So if we can get in our mind, it's going to be hard. I know it breaks our mind. But when 70 souls walked in with Jacob and the 12 tribes into Egypt, 70, there are already millions in Africa at the time of the fellow Shemmites. We're talking, all we trace is these 70 that went into Egypt and came out as a mixed group out of Egypt. Yes, by that time there were 1 million more people, more or less, but they were 1 million among 30, 40, 50, 90 million already in Africa at the time. So when this group went down into Canaanite lands, they didn't colonize all of Africa. Africa already had its nations. And as we see in the Bible, they were told not to take the lands of other peoples and other nations, except the Canaanites. Why? Because the Canaanites had stolen the land of Shem. They didn't have any right to the land, whereas all the other Shemmites who were already in the land had right to the land. And yes, of course, there's been fighting between the different groups of people among the Shemmites over time. But at this time, Moses and Joshua and Caleb and them, they were not to go against Shemmites. They were to go against the Canaanites. In my opinion, somewhere in the South Sudan, Southeast Ethiopia, Kenya, Uganda area, somewhere in there, they went up to battle and conquered much of the Canaanite territory. Not all of it, as we know, but a lot of it, and got back the heart of the continent, a heart of Shem's lands, were gotten back by this group of people, the forsaken 12 that came out of Egypt, and they fulfilled their role that the Father wanted them to do. And so we see that the Father's hand was upon these people from the beginning. We see when the 70 souls went into Egypt, and even with the treachery of the brothers of Joseph, we still see that the Father used them to his purpose. And Joseph, he was blessed with the dreams and the interpretation. But the Pharaoh, the Mizraimite, the Hamite, he was blessed of the Father as well. And the Spirit must have worked upon him, because he invited Joseph to be his second in command and saved all the house of Israel at the time. And then we see the Hamites, the Cushites, keeping the records, the book of Jubilees, the books of Maccabees, all the different books we have because of the Septuagint Bible, all the books we have because of the Ethiopian Bible. And the fact, in my opinion, maybe even more important, it shows how important and integral the Ethiopian Bible used the Septuagint and not the Masoretic Bible text we have in our Bibles today. When we study the Ethiopian Bible, we see a Bible that is much more like the Bible Jesus handled. And when we study the one we have, we see much more the hand of Rome and the hand of the Pharisees. So it isn't a bad idea to get yourselves a copy of the Septuagint. I don't have one yet. I read from it, but I need to get myself a copy. But the Septuagint and the Ethiopian Bible, they allow these 1,000 years, they allow this 500 years before, like with Peleg, all this time for Nimrod to build his city and the people to start to spread and for the kingdom start to grow. With the text we have for our Bible, they've only got a couple hundred years and everything's supposed to be there and it doesn't fit. But once we put the breath back in with Babel, then we can start to see the rest of it all coming into pieces and into harmony. So if you find people are challenging you on the Bible and your belief in the Bible because the archaeology shows that Sumer and Gilgamesh and the Ethiopian area of Cush and Meroe and also Egypt, these things predate the flood, and we start to wonder, and then we go, oh, okay, I'm not. You don't have to give up. Once you can get your hands on the Septuagint and the Ethiopian Bible and start to understand it, then that is gone. And then once you can understand where Babel truly was and understand where Jerusalem might be, I don't know for certain, but I do believe it was in Africa, and the land of the Bible is all in Africa. Then we can forget the land that shall not be named up above Egypt, where we believe it all happened, and I don't believe any of it happened. Not even a jot or a tittle happened in that area. And it was just part of the Egyptian empire. But be that as it may, we can start to not lose our faith in the Bible. But if we believe that that land is the Holy Land that's just north of Egypt and east, and if we believe that the Bible flood happened at 2300 or 2400 BC, then we are going to be rocked in our faith, especially as things move forward now. But if we can start to come back to the original text of the Ethiopian Bible, the Septuagint, and put back the 100 years per patriarch all the way up through to Adam, we can put back the 100 years per person, and we can put Cainan back in as the son of Arphaxad and the father of Shelah. Then if we can do that, then we can start to see and trust the Father and trust the Bible and trust the timeline. I hope you've enjoyed this. I hope it gives you some encouragement if you are from Shem, that you have value. It doesn't matter where you're from the 12 tribes or not. You're from the people the 12 tribes came from, which is Shem. And you're of that same inheritance, a great inheritance. And I hope that you don't want to trade off your father. If your father was Melchizedek and not Abraham, are you going to throw Melchizedek under the bus because, no, I want Abraham to be my father? I find that disheartening. I think it's important that we have the fathers that we have, and we are where the Father has placed us, and it'll all work out in the end. I'm going to leave a link here to the Babel video that I did, if you want to go back and look at it. And I'll put another video here that you might find really interesting that I just finished doing. Thanks, and have yourselves a good day, and take care. Appreciate y'all. Bye-bye.